This time on MTG Deck Busters, it's Eldrazi Shenanigans with Esper Exile. I actually said it right this time.
Welcome back to MTG Deck Busters, and this time we're going to do something a little bit differently. Normally I like to play decks that have been posted on YouTube so that I can link to their deck tech video, especially when that YouTuber has not done a playthrough of their own. It allows you to see the deck in play before you build it. But when we were playing the Evolving Angels deck, we ran against an opponent who had a very interesting deck with a lot of mechanics that I've actually been wanting to use for a while. And he was kind enough to link to us the deck list. So this deck was built by Miso18 over on the XMH.de servers, and it uses a mechanic that started off in Battle for Zendikar that hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention. I think people were excited about it maybe when it first came out. I wasn't playing back then, so I don't know. But it didn't really go anywhere. But there's a single card in Eldritch Moon that's already pretty good, and the mechanic makes it over the top. So let's get into these cards. First of all, we've got 4 copies of Phantom Feeder. Devoid, Death Touch, Ingest. 5 mana, draw a card. Each opponent exiles the top cards of her library. So later game, it feeds our Exile, which we'll explain in a moment. You've got 4 copies of Spell Queller from Eldritch Moon. Flash Flying. When Spell Queller enters the battlefield, exile target spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. It exiles the spell. That's going to become important too. This deck is called Esper Exile for a reason. Next we've got Wasteland Strangler, and here's where the mechanic I'm talking about really comes into play. Devoid, when Wasteland Strangler enters the battlefield, you may put a card an opponent owns from exile into that player's graveyard. If you do, target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. So what does this mean? If you exile a spell with Spell Queller, Wasteland Strangler can take that exiled spell and put it in the graveyard. One of the downsides to Spell Queller is that when Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, the exiled card may be cast. The exiled card's owner may cast that card without paying its mana cost. When Spell Queller leaves the battlefield, the exiled owner may cast the card without paying its mana cost. And that's usually the downside. Is usually they remove the Spell Queller, get their spell back for free, and carry on. But if you've put that card in the graveyard with Wasteland Strangler, Spell Queller doesn't let them cast the card when it dies. The other thing that allows you to do is it allows you to blink Spell Queller to exile another card. And that's one of the things that Spirits decks have a problem with, is that they like to run Essence Flux. And if you Essence Flux Queller, they get the spell that you originally exiled back before you can take the new one. And that brings us to Eldrazi Displacer. Eldrazi Displacer, Devoid, exile another target creature and return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So once you've freed up the Spell Queller with the Wasteland Strangler, you can then displace it to get another spell. Winds up being a reusable Spell Queller over and over again. And the other nice thing about Eldrazi Displacer is that it allows you to do weird things with your opponent's Spell Quellers as well. If you use the Eldrazi Displacer on their turn to nix their Spell Queller, it causes the Spell Queller to exile one of their own spells, because you get your spell back first. And then if there's another spell on the stack, the Spell Queller eats it. Note that Spell Queller does not say may. When Spell Queller enters the battlefield, exile target spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. If the only spell on the stack is the opponent's, or your opponent's, then they have to do it. It's not a may. 3 copies of Reflector Mage. Pretty straightforward. 4 copies of Matter Reshaper. All of our creatures except for 1 have casting cost 3 or less. We've also got Liliana, which is 3 mana. So Matter Reshaper gives us a lot of great value. 2 copies of Ulamog's Nullifier. Devoid, Flash Flying. When Ulamog's Nullifier enters the battlefield, you may put 2 cards from your opponent's own from exile to their owner's graveyards. If you do, counter target spell. So once again, another way to free up Spell Queller and just get more value out of the Exile. It's got a bit of a body as well, so it's reminiscent of Spellstutter Sprite from Lorwyn. Fairies were the dominant strategy in Lorwyn Shadowmoor, such that there was no deck that can beat them. There was one deck that beat them once, but then Fairies just evolved to work around that strategy. Declaration Stone, pretty straightforward. 2 copies of Warping Whale. And this is how I know that this deck was changed. When I first looked at this, I'm pretty sure there's only 1 copy of Warping Whale. I kind of thought it was weird to only have 1 copy of Warping Whale, but he's changed it. There's 2 in the deck now. 2 copies of Horribly Awry. Counter target spell, creature spell with mana cost 4 or less. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. 2 copies of Painful Truth. And Painful Truth is one that I actually didn't even know existed. It is strictly better than, in most situations, than the new standard Succumb to Temptation. Read the Bones is rotating out. Succumb to Temptation has same converted mana cost, but it has 2 black mana as casting cost. And Painful Truths gives you 2 cards for 2 life. Painful Truths is just as, if you have 2 colors in mana, Painful Truths is just as good as that, except it doesn't cost 2 black. And if you've got 3 colors, like this deck does, you get 3 cards for 3 mana. So Painful Truths, in my opinion, is strictly better than Succumb to Temptation, except in mono black. These last 3 singleton cards here don't need much explaining. Anguish in Making, exiles a card. Stasis Snare, exiles a card. Void Shatter, counter target spell, and exile it instead of putting this on its graveyard. Basically cancel that exiles. And then we've got 2 copies of Liliana's The Last Hope. Now Liliana here seems a little out of place for the deck. It doesn't feel like it belongs. It does give you some card drawing, some creature getting. And it does have the late game finisher with the emblems, but I think it's a little out of place here. Alright, so let's go into the lands. So most of the lands are pretty basic. 2 Sunken Hollows, 2 Swamps, 3 Prairie Streams, a Waste, 4 Plains, 2 Islands, 2 Shambling Vents, 4 Evolving Wilds. This one here, Corrupted Crossroads, is basically a pain land for Devoid. Pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, spend this mana only to cast spells with Devoid. Now, I was pretty sure when I played against him that he was running the Origins Painlands, and I was thinking about this deck, thinking, you know what? Because of that, this won't survive rotation. This card here makes this deck survive rotation. Almost all of our cards have the Void, except for the Eldrazi that are already colorless. Some of our spells have the Void. Spell Queller doesn't have the Void, and that's unfortunate. Neither does Anguish to Making your Stasis Snare. And neither does Reflector Mage. But pretty much everything else can be cast with Corrupted Crossroads. Alright, so I'm going to go to the other view to have a look at the sideboard, because there's a lot of singleton cards. 2 copies of Duress. There's another card that I'd like to see in place of Duress here, but I'll save that for the wrap-up, where I'll go through which cards I'd add to this deck. I will say this, though. If you look at the deck list for the Rakdos Burn deck that I played, pretty much all the black cards in the Rakdos Burn sideboard would be very good in this deck. We've got 1 single Ultimate Price, got 2 Gideon Ally of Zendikar, 2 Kalitas or Kalitas, Trader of Get, 2 Languish, 2 Avacyn's, 1 Tragic Arrogance, 1 Dragonlord Silgamar, 1 Linvala the Preserver, 1 Distended Mindbender. Now this sideboard doesn't survive rotation, but that's okay. The rest of the deck does. I'm also finding this sideboard a little bit, I don't know, I think he's kind of experimenting with things and not really, I don't think the sideboard is set in stone yet. Now one of the things about this deck is that paper version will cost you $350. And that's pretty expensive, especially for a deck that rotates out in about 7 months. It'll be 3 months after Kaladesh comes out. That said, though, I think that this deck might be viable in Modern with a few changes. Again, I'll talk about the changes in the wrap-up. Um, the removing cards from Exile could really hurt decks that rely on Suspend. And it's worth pointing out that this $350 includes the 2 copies of Liliana's Hope, which is $90 right there, and 3 of these cards that are in the sideboard, 2 Gideons, 2 Kalatases, and 2 Avacens. Those could probably be taken out for something else if you wanted to make this closer to a budget deck. I'm really excited to play this deck, so let's get right to it.
While I was editing this video, I went back and looked at the Evolving Angels match, and I noticed that the card list did in fact change. And one of the cards that's missing in the new version is the 2 copies of Mind Melter. Now, if you watch the Evolving Angels game, Mind Melter did a lot of work. It gets in for damage and can't be blocked. It looks like you took out the Mind Melters for the Reflector Mage, which the Reflector Mage is a pretty good card in this deck. However, I would still include the Mind Melters probably in the sideboard, just because it can't be blocked. And in decks that can't deal with creatures as easily, such as GW tokens and Bant, getting in for consistent damage is really good.